I think we're ready to get started for you. It looks like I'm gonna be the only one in your room until Mariah gets here, physically in person, but we're recording and gonna share these too, so I hope that's okay.
Oh, I'm here too.
Oh, yes, and we should include Kyle, absolutely. I wanted to let all of the participants know on Zoom that I am going to write down who is here for your session, and later I'm gonna draw names and email someone for a book copy of your lovely signed book. So I will be doing that.
Woo! I will say, Jen, I had one of my students that I had recommended. Well, I have several students who have read at least part of your book, but I had one who took my copy and kept it for like a month and read it every day in her English class. And she came back and she was like, Miss Omar, I cried. So.
Absolutely charming. Thank you. You made my day.
I'm so glad. And I have a girl who I really love who's a very reluctant reader, but she has Native American heritage. And so I recommended it to her just the other day. And she was like, yeah, I want to read that. So.
Excellent. So I know people might be joining us later as well, but I wanted to go ahead and turn the session over to Jen Ferguson, who is visiting us today from Iowa. Are you in Iowa today, Jennifer? And she is creative writing, has a new lovely YA book out. It's called The Summer of Bitter and Sweet. And so, like I said, she was nice enough to donate a signed copy, and I will be taking down names, and one of you participants will get this lovely copy at the end of the event. And I'll be in touch with you about that. But otherwise, we've been pretty informal today. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Jen.
So I also thought we could be pretty informal and have a conversation or start to think through some issues. And then I can read a little bit of the book later. So Anna is an educator. We've got educators around us. And one of the things that I thought that I wanted to start thinking about was, what were the books that you read as a teenager? What did the bookshelf look like at the library, or what did the bookshelf look like at the bookstore? So if you want to take a minute and think about that and then share out.
Oh my gosh, can I start?
Yeah.
So I got in trouble for reading things that were not YA, right? So a librarian actually accosted my mother about my reading choices, and I got in trouble. But luckily my mom also told her that she can't do that. But otherwise, I think mostly I read a lot of white women authors, which makes sense because I was a white girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would kind of second that. I had academic aspirations, we'll say. And so like I was for a long time, mostly in high school, I became very I don't even know how, like, snobby about my reading. Like I would suffer through like books that I did not want to read just so I could say that I was, a reader, like, and which was, fine, I guess, because like I really do love like Pride and Prejudice. Like that book is just really, it feels homey to me. But yeah, other than, prior to, I mostly was reading still white women, looking at like, sort of like teenage romances and anything that was a tearjerker and things. A lot of books with characters who looked like me, characters that I could connect to or wanted to connect to.
I read a lot of
Do any of you remember what the options were on the shelf for like YA books when you were a teen?
A separate piece. And I think Where the Red Fern Grows, even though I think that's technically children, and The Hobbit, all written by white men.
I think of a lot of like Sarah Dessen, Also, I would have the Hunger Games and like Twilight were very popular at that time.
We also had Hardy Boys and the counterpart woman that I never read.
Nancy Drew.
Nancy Drew.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kyle.
Does
Never read those either.
Does anyone else remember Lurleen McDaniel? That
Oh my
woman
gosh,
who
yes.
wrote all the dying kids books. Yeah.
Yes. And Little House on the Prairie, of course.
Yes.
Those books.
So all I read as a teenager were those Lurleen McDaniel books where it's always a 16-year-old girl being like, I have 6 months to live and I want to kiss a boy. And like that was one of the spaces that my local library, they had like 26 Lurleen McDaniel books.
Yeah.
And every single story was, I am dying and I'd like to experience some life before I die tragically. And they always die tragically at the end. Like, I am dying, the end is they die.
And like romance.
Yes.
Mhm.
Plus the sort of Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Sweet Valley High stuff. That was about the extent of what I saw on the bookshelves as a teenager. So like Rebecca, I was reading adult books and I was reading voraciously as an adult, and I had no snotty aspirations. I was like, I read Anne Rice's Belinda as like a 14-year-old. And that is like a problematic book for maybe a 14-year-old to start reading without any context and with no one to talk to about the book. Yeah, you can like Google the synopsis for that one. It is intense.
Yeah, it was the Boston Strangler that I was reading that got me in trouble at the library. A true story about true crime.
I was reading a book about an adult man having a relationship with a teenage girl. That was what I was reading, right? Like, because there weren't other options, and I was not interested in Sweet Valley High or the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew.
No.
There were a few YA fantasy series by Tamora Pierce that had started to pop up when I was maybe 15, 16, but it was very white.
Speaking of,
Yeah, the Swiftly Tilting Planet and all of those, Madeline L'Engle.
speaking of like the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, I was never interested in those either, but I feel like I can just look at the cover. I know how it's gonna turn out. There's no mystery in that for me. Like,
Yes.
I was reading what Tolkien.
Not Tolkien. Yes,
Yeah,
we just
but
talked
that
about him
was
in
just,
class.
yeah, Tolkien, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings. That was my.
So part of the problem with the books we had access to is they may have not have been interesting to us. Or they may have catered, in the case of the stuff that Anna, you started talking about with like Twilight, very particular readers and a very particular story to be told that got told over and over again in those kinds of books. Very much a fantasy romance story, which leaves a lot of readers out. So my follow-up question to this is, what does this do to readers who either do see themselves represented in what's on the shelves, or readers who don't see themselves represented with what's on the shelves?
You know, when you first asked your question, I thought, I don't remember reading that much as a teenager. I don't remember. I remember in, I think 5th or 6th grade, I had a librarian who used to make displays of like Newbery nominated books, and I would read through those displays. They were all about boys, but they were still at least decent books that I loved. But then we moved, and I just don't remember reading until college, when I finally picked up like a Toni Morrison book and was like, oh, this is better.
This is better.
I read those Newbery books too. Our library did the same thing, always had like a display. And I have to admit, like, I loved it, and I didn't ever think about not being represented. But I think that what it did for me was made me think that the world would work for me the way it did for those protagonists. And I was a little let down when people wouldn't listen to me about things, or when I realized that maybe I didn't have certain authority that I just assumed like all of us had growing up. We were all doing the same thing. As my parents would say, I was very surprised that I was not a boy.
I think for me, I think it narrowed my perspective because a lot of the books that I was reading were, you know, teenage, like at least like late middle school, early high school, were a lot of like young, like 15-year-old white girls who fall in love and that's their entire life. And so I was not particularly, I don't know. I chased a lot of like romance in my mind because of that, because I thought that that was the end all be all. Like I knew, if I don't have a boyfriend, right, high school doesn't mean anything. And so I think it really narrowed my perspective. And then additionally, when I became, a much more snobby reader of like, oh, I only read the classics, right? Like I became completely distanced from the reading itself. And so it became almost like a chore that I'm doing versus like because I want to be perceived a certain way. And so I think it ultimately, like, that idea really damaged my relationship with reading. And I just think overall it narrowed my idea of like who I am as a person and who or what I expect to see in books.
Thank you. So you're all sort of dancing around some of the things that I see YA in particular, but also middle grade and other children's literature showing up and doing differently in the last 5, 6, 7 years in a way that adult fiction still hasn't caught up or hasn't decided is important to them. I was talking to a writer friend the other day, and they said that they had a book rejected by an editor because if you want to do that diversity stuff, you do it in YA. Like it doesn't belong in adult fiction. So that might illustrate part of the problem. But I'm also thinking about if you are reading as a young person and every single character you read is, say, middle class, and you're not, what that does to your ability to imagine yourself as the protagonist of your life, or to imagine yourself as able to be the protagonist of a story. We can do the same thing with a bunch of other identity markers. We can look at how folks in publishing, still in the adult side, less so in the kidlit side, used to say and or still say that certain populations don't read. They are not readers. They will just straight up say, Black people don't read. And therefore, why do we need to have books that have characters who are Black as main characters if they don't read, if they're not buying books? So there's this capitalistic sentiment behind the storytelling and the valuing of whose stories matter that do irreparable damage to readers. And it took me a really long time. I was in my early 30s before I recognized the damage of consuming all those books I consumed, because I wasn't a reader. And then I went to summer camp and was really bored laying in a canvas tent at night. And the person next to me passed a fantasy book, an adult fantasy book to me. I devoured it. And then I became a reader for the rest of my life. But there was a damage to reading the things that I was reading. And that was that I could only imagine myself as a certain thing And I couldn't imagine myself beyond that thing. What changes when we see ourselves represented in fiction or in stories or in media? Or how can you see how your trajectory could have changed if you saw more representation of a part of you that did not get that?
Well, I don't know about me, but as a teacher, things like this have happened, right? Where I was teaching an online intro to lit class and I had them read diverse poetry. And I had a student who emailed me and said, I didn't think poetry was for me. And his paper that he wrote about the poem he chose then was beautiful. But he was so excited because there was a poem that spoke directly to him and his experience as a young Black man. And he just didn't know that poetry was for him, he said.
So you're literally pointing out something that has been socialized in a person, so much so that they believe that a form of art is not a form of art that welcomes them, or that sees them as an audience or a reader or a participator in that form.
Or that could write poetry even, because the poet was also young and Black and male. And
yeah,
I don't remember the title of it now. I want to say it was something about dinosaurs in the hood.
it was Dinez Smith.
Perfect. But I mean, he was thinking like, I didn't know that I was supposed to be reading poetry.
Right.
And then he wrote a great paper about a thing that he thought he couldn't do.
So that is someone coming to that realization in, hi Nixie, go lay down, please. Someone coming to that realization at college.
Yes.
And they tell us that we do a lot of our identity formation as children and as teens. Mm-hmm. So there is something that YA publishing is doing that is trying to make sure that the kids who come up after us don't end up in a college classroom saying they didn't think poetry was for them, because there will be lots of poetry. There will be novels in verse. There will be novels with poets as main characters. All of those things are sort of like a correction to something that we've determined is problematic and actually dangerous for all of us growing up when you only see some stories. So that's part of what I wanted to talk about. I also wanted to make sure that if there was something you all wanted to talk about, that we discussed it. So if you have a question or a thought or a piece of knowledge that you want to share, I'd like to make sure that you have the space to do that.
First, I want to apologize for the crazy outburst of doggage. I know this is something that I am very, maybe like immersed in right now, because our second unit, so we're in a narrative unit. And previously, my first year we did like fractured fairy tales, and then last year we did, I did short stories, and I tried to make them as diverse as possible, because I wanted kids. At that time, it was more about interest. Like I wanted kids to have something that they could, find interesting. And so this year, I did a lot of, I did a symposium over the summer, I did an institute over the summer, and then I did a lot of reading, and I realized I just really wanted to make kids readers, because over and over again I would hear, well, you know, oh, I hate reading. I don't like reading. And that's all just, I'm not reading the right books. Right. And so I decided, I was like, I'm just gonna, like, we're just gonna do this. We're just gonna dive in and we're gonna read. And I've been so impressed, like, I almost regret not reading more widely now. Because I do think a lot of it has been in the past few years, but like, I love reading with my kids at this point, like, because the books are so diverse and so interesting. And so like, I was able to select 5 lit circle books that my kids just started this week. And so I have The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And then I have Patron Saints of Nothing, All American Boys, Burn Baby Burn, and what's my 4th? Oh, Punching the Air. Which if you haven't read it, this a gateway book this year, so good. Look it up. Literally can't say enough. I read it in one day. And so I've just been so impressed by the amount of novels in verse, because my kids will say, oh, I know that I can't stay focused for like a whole page. And I'll be like, well, here, try this. And then they become readers and they start looking for books that, you know, they're like, oh, let me read another novel in verse. Oh, okay, well, this isn't in verse, but I like this book. And so I do think that there's a lot going on in, I don't know, in the YA publication that they're doing right. And I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, as far as like student interest versus writer's interest.
I think that which came first is there were a bunch of storytellers who previously weren't welcome by publishing, who had been telling stories or had found that they had to tell stories about middle class white girls who are straight and not disabled in order to be able to write books. So at some point, that critical mass of, I can't keep doing this, or I refuse to do this, or I know there are kids who need the story that I can tell from my experience. That sort of put pressure. The other thing that I've been thinking about is the question we had earlier at Jake Skeetz's plenary that talked about how to like find harmful material. And one of the things I've been thinking about for the past couple hours now is that if you don't have a diverse reading experience, you can't see what's problematic. If you don't have the ability to have lots of stories about lots of different people, you can't see when a story is problematic or when a story is doing harm. If it's the only story that there is about a certain group, or if it's the only story that exists, you don't develop a literacy in other kinds of stories or in other kinds of storytelling.
I was wondering too, Jen, so as a medievalist, where there's also a lot of gatekeeping in terms of publishing, they say it's blind review, but they usually know when it's a woman or a scholar of color who wrote the article. So did you see that there are like new publishing companies that are addressing this issue, or did we actually move some of the gatekeeping in the older publishing companies?
Yes, that's a really good question. So I'm published by HarperCollins. Mm-hmm. They are like one of the big 4 or 5, I don't know. We just stopped 2 of the other ones from like becoming one big snake. And HarperCollins is, how will I say this nicely? They're there to make money, right? And they will publish a problematic white man who feels like some of us shouldn't exist because it'll make them money, right? They don't actually care about ethics, truly. Not saying that everyone at HarperCollins doesn't care about ethics, So I'm published by an imprint of HarperCollins called Heartdrum. They publish Native writers who write for children and teens, and that is it. So they have a different ethos than the rest of HarperCollins, and they approach things differently. I'm thinking sort of the solution that publishing seems to have come up with is we will make imprints that focus on specific needs. Like there's an imprint that publishes Muslim children's stories called Salam Reads. And there's an imprint that does like adult queer fiction. And we've all sort of gotten segregated in order to be treated well, right? And that's something that we've seen happen. We've seen segregation happen before. It might not be the best way to handle making sure that diverse creators are treated well. But that seems to be most of what's happening is a big publishing house creates an imprint to address an issue and lets the imprint have different values than maybe the rest of the publishing house. There are some smaller publishing houses that pop up that will have a mandate, and their mandate will be to publish certain kinds of books. They just can't compete in the same commercial capitalist market that a publisher like HarperCollins can. Like HarperCollins has big money bags behind them, and that small new publisher often doesn't have the same ability to pay writers well, and getting paid matters to your, like in a capitalist society, that matters to your livelihood, right?
So when I was a kid, hi Jen, by the way.
Hi, friend.
I miss you. I miss Nixon too. When I was a kid, I don't remember seeing a lot that makes me so happy. I didn't see a lot of diverse, I'm a Native American woman, and I don't remember seeing any Native Americans besides Pocahontas and like the racist images of us in like old Westerns like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. And so that was really disheartening. And so the only people I saw were people in my family. And then I feel like in the last 5 or 10 years, we've really gotten a lot bigger presence just all across media and across the world. There's a lot more actual Native representation of different tribes, different cultures. And so I'm wondering, like, as that push has happened, is that creating more of an open door for smaller like sectors of this publishing? Is that why that's happening, do you think? It's not really because HarperCollins wants to, but because the mass society is pushing them to be more diverse?
So yes, and is the answer.
Right.
Yes, they're being pushed by the market, and they're being pushed because they're recognizing that they can publish diverse YA, and turns out it can hit the New York Times bestseller list because tons of people go out and buy it, and turns out it makes them money.
Right.
They still haven't recognized, like they think that sometimes it's a one shot. They're like, ooh, we did that once and we'll never be able to replicate it, and we don't know why. Right, so like it makes them money, and if it's going to make them money, they're going to do it. But the other thing, the and part, is there are people in publishing, there are lots of really like conscientious good humans in publishing. A lot of them are white, a lot of them are white women.
Mhm.
And that is partially because publishing still works as a, you get an internship and you work for free for a while, and you work for free for like 6 different people before you get to build your own list, or before you get to move in and get paid $35,000 a year to live in Manhattan, right? Like, so you see the structural problems that lead to mostly white women being lasting in publishing. But my imprint is headed by a white woman in her 60s who was approached by other people, like approached by Cynthia Ladick Smith, who's a Native kids writer, and approached by We Need Diverse Books, which is a wonderful organization that does exactly what their title says. We need diverse books for a bunch of reasons. And my editor was like, yes, of course I want to do this. And then used her power well to talk to the publisher of HarperCollins and be like, I want to do this. And he was like, here you go, take some money, go do that thing. Right. So like, yes, and there are people who care and want to make a change. And there are people who have always cared and have been making a change, like one book at a time.
Thank God.
Right.
We need more.
Right. Are there any other questions or discussion points or thoughts that you want to address? I'm happy to keep talking. I actually hate reading from my own work pretty desperately. So.
Well, I guess like maybe we should ask you the same question that we asked Jake, especially for those of us who are well-intentioned white women. Like what kinds of actionable things should we be doing, and like how can we help as this movement moves forward?
Yeah, so because we live in a capitalist society, you have to speak with your dollars. It's really as simple as that. And that means that you support, you're buying gifts for your nieces and nephews, right? And you choose particular gifts to give them, like books by diverse creators, or you shop small and local from an person who is native making beadwork, selling it on Etsy or like whatever. But that idea that your dollar in a capitalist society says what you care about. It also means that if you have power, that you use your power well. So when I'm thinking about educators, right? Like you get to pick what books your kids read. Asterisks, like sometimes there are things that the state will tell you you must do that you cannot get around. But you have the power to expose people to other ideas. I don't know if I've ever told this story at MSSU, but while I was teaching at MSSU in a literature course, I had a student who literally thought the world was flat. As like a 20-something-year-old who had left Missouri at some point to go somewhere else and then came back to go to school, straight up thought the world was flat because no one had ever introduced a narrative that suggested otherwise. Right? So like your power to expose someone to another idea. And I don't mean to change how they think or be aggressive here, just that student was working in a team, and as soon as his team heard this idea out of his head, they provided a bunch of evidence and a bunch of different narratives to explain like that is not a thing, that is not, there are other competing narratives and we'd like to present you some. And the student walked out of the classroom just being like, whoa. Right? Like it was a deeply transformative moment. And I know that there are stories I didn't have as a young person that account for how long it took me to like break down a lot of the colonial structures that I carry around as someone who was educated in colonial Canada, right? It took me a long time to break a lot of those structures down. But similarly, it took me a long time to recognize like my queerness, or like what kind of queer person I was, because I had never, ever, until I was like 30 something, read a story with a demisexual character in it. So because I didn't know the narrative existed, because no one had told me the world was round, I could not imagine the world being round. So you have power, use it well.
So I think kind of along those similar lines, like, are there particular texts that you would recommend or activities that you would recommend for like someone in my position where I have, I am white, I am teaching to a community that is highly impoverished, but
Right.
mostly majority white still. Like, how do we as educators go about broadening horizons and in a way that will add to and not detract?
I have two points for you. One is that you enter as a learner with your students, right? And like you show them that. You are not the expert sharing from above. You are a learner. And if you are a learner with them and they can see that you are a learner with them, you acknowledge when you make mistakes. I literally just got an email from my current educational institution that was celebrating Native American Heritage Month, and it said beads. Beads were a tool that showed us importance from the past. And it was like an entire narrative about how beadwork was important to Native Americans who are all long dead and gone. And it was really painfully problematic. And I might have accidentally replied all to all students and all faculty and staff at the campus and just like fixed, I know. I just fixed the sentence. I was like, beads are tools that show us the past, the present, and the future. Hey, wonderful, fix this. Did literally the DEI people on campus, did they say, whoops, I made a mistake and I'm going to tell you I made a mistake and I'm going to learn from the mistake? No, they like sent me like a back channel email being like, we need to have a conversation so that we can heal from this. And I was like, you'll never acknowledge publicly the thing that you did. And there is so much value in being like, darn, I effed up someone's pronouns. I know better. I'm going to fix this. Or I held this point of view that is a problematic point of view. And like telling your students that models how to do that in their lives. And we are humans and we are messy and we are flawed and we are going to make mistakes over and over and over again. And so few of us know how to be like, I made a mistake. I'm going to say it publicly and then fix things. And the second thing is, I don't know. The power of you saying, I don't know, but let's find out together. And because you do know more than students about like how to find good sources. You know how to find answers that will like lead you further along your path of learning. I made a mistake saying it publicly, and then I don't know, and let's find an answer together. And like that's how you navigate anything at all in the world. And it applies 100% to like reading outside of your experience or your students' experience. And maybe the last thing I'll say is like socioeconomic status actually might help a student like reach another kind of empathetic understanding that is like a different thing, but they feel like it has similarities. So like building on what your students do know and like that their knowledge is valuable and that knowledge will help them to understand other things, maybe faster than a student who's like comfortably middle class or well off.
Yeah, and that's something that we have talked about too. It's so funny that you brought up that email because just last week we listened to the Danger of a Single Story by Adichie, and then we talked about single stories, and the one that I had them do a little bit of research and reading on was Native Americans and the idea that they don't exist anymore. And so I had them, I stole it from someone online. I don't remember where I saw it, but I had them like look up, okay, just Google Native Americans, look at the pictures, make some inferences. And then I gave them a Newsella article where they just read, and it had pictures, and it was all modern Native Americans. What? And they were all like, what? They're using computers to learn? They don't live in, and it was just this like moment of, and so that's what I was thinking of. But yeah, there's definitely a stigma about living in independence, working in independence, going to school in independence. And it's interesting to see that some of them connect their experiences of like, and all kids who are seriously struggling at home, and they can connect to these feelings of worthlessness. And even though, they're white and their skin color is never going to cause them, you know, to be discriminated against. I have kids who don't have front teeth. I have kids who like, and so it's just like, they can still like understand that identifier of being of difference. So yeah, I just think it's, sorry, I could completely like steal your talk and just talk about the importance of
No,
why
I love this. I love this.
and like how the impact that like that focus in my classroom just this year and the 4 months I've had my kids has made on them and on me as an educator, saying like, oh no, teenagers read, you just have to get the right books in their hands. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but like you're making a lot of points that younger educators in high schools probably get, because they've come up at a time where things have started to change in publishing, right? Like it's all this stuff is related. And if you remember walking into a bookstore and seeing representation on the shelves, and seeing diverse stories on the shelves, you're not going to fight the idea that like some stories are problematic and hurtful in the same way you will if you only ever saw your one experience represented. It's just something that's going to be changing because of how publishing is changing and how many stories now exist when there used to be one story. Any last thoughts, questions, comments?
Comment, your earrings are really cute. Not relevant. I just like them.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you for the full display.
I have also been looking at them the whole time.
Great.
I've realized that I have more pieces of jewelry that have that little peachy color in my earrings than in my glasses than I thought. So it was not intentional. It just happens.
Well, in homage to you, I also wore the earrings that you made for me.
I'm wearing Jen earrings as well.
We're all wearing Jen earrings. So.
Love that. Love that. And I'm happy to leave things here. I'm happy to tell you if you want, particularly if you're an educator, We Need Diverse Books has grants. They have lots of different ways to like help promote diverse books in your life. If you are someone who is a writer and or someone who wants to like find a book list because you have to buy something for a holiday for someone, like We Need Diverse Books has a blog with all the different kinds of diverse you could ever want or need. I will also say that there's a website called LGBTQ Reads, which is also just a massive compendium of all the queer books you could want in all the, like from picture books to adults, broken down by like what kind of queerness is represented. So there are some really wonderful resources out there if you don't know where to start, or if you feel like you've been going to the same example over and over again, and you're like, oh, okay, it might be important to share something that was more recently published, or it might be important to see if there is another story that deals with this experience that could resonate further. So maybe that's where I'll leave it, like all the resources, find me online and ask for more resources if you want them. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me, friends.
Yeah, so I will say excellent. Thank you so much, Jen.
It's a treat to see you all.
Yes, and I will say, because she won't do it herself, I will say if you haven't read her book yet, you should.
It's so good.
It is so very good, and I will be in touch because I will draw a name from this session to get the free signed copy, and it won't be my own name, so. I will be in touch about that. And there is a short closing session at 4:30. It's just basically me saying thank you to everyone. And we're going to draw for the raffle for the quilt. So if you have purchased tickets, you might be interested in that. We are also doing a fundraiser called Blind Date the Book, and a lot of authors have been generous enough to sign books, and a lot of diverse YA that we've been talking about. I was so happy. I wanted to buy all of them myself, but I wrapped them instead. And I will have those available in my office at MSSU if anybody wants to come by at any time to pick one up. So how it works is we've wrapped them in brown paper. They have a genre on them and a couple of teasers that, you know, may or may not be good teasers. Some of them are mine, so, you know, and it's $15 for one, $25 for two, and there are so many good reads in it if anyone's on campus and willing to come by.
I know so many people who are writers who were like, yeah, I'll send a book. I'm so excited to support the scholarship. So
yes, and when they came in, I read back covers furiously, and I was like, oh my God, this sounds so good. So I'll have to see if you guys can steal them from me.
Can you send me, I'm not on campus, but can you send me a list of some of the good ones?
Oh, I'll take a picture and you can pick one.
Oh, okay.
And media mail is cheap to send books. Media mail is the way to go.
Okay.
Yes, because one of my friends sent a book of poetry and it was in an envelope, and she did it herself and just hit envelope, and she's like, I think that maybe you're gonna have some postage too. She's like, that's what happens when you send a poet to do real things.
True story. Absolutely true story. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jen. It was good
Bye,
to see
Jen.
you.
Bye, Nix.
Bye, people.
Bye.